All right. Good evening, everyone. We are starting tonight with Maseches Eruvin. We're on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, and we'll also be doing tonight Daf Mem Amud Aleph. We'll be doing a blot and a half, turning to the top of Mem Amud Beis. I want to be able to tell you that on Rosh Hashanah day I'll do a blot and a half. I want to be able to tell you that. I'm hopeful. I'll guarantee you the blot, Bli Neder, and I hope. But we'll see. Whatever happens, happens. Huh? We're learning both days.
You do a blot and a quarter and a blot and a quarter.
Yeah, it's not a.
As long as by Sunday you're done.
We'll be caught up. The latest we'd be caught up is probably Sunday night, probably, which should be fine, because that's the only night we're recording between now and then anyway. So the rest we're doing together here. So, sorry, Sunday. Oh, Sunday night, forget it. So then Monday night we'll catch up. Yeah.
Oh no.
Correct. Sorry.
No.
Come to show. We won't tell you.
I'll be at Shabbos Sunday, so be caught up by Sunday.
All right, here we go.
Represent the no one that's here.
So the Mishnah begins on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, about halfway down. We're going to be learning a lot of dicey sugyas tonight, which have certain nuances to them. So let's stay focused. And the Mishnah here opens up with the following idea, and perfectly timed, apropos. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rosh Hashanah, Shahaya Yare Shemati Saber. Now we're all calendarized perfectly out for as many hundreds of years as we would wish, down to the minute. We know exactly when Shabbos will start in 500 years from now, if there is a 500 years from now. But the point is that back in the day they didn't. They were Mekadesh the Chodesh al Pi Re'iyah. They would look out and see when the moon was. So there was a concern of whether or not that in a particular year that it was going to be Tis Aber, that it might be ended up being two days. Now nowadays our Rosh Chodesh, our Rosh Hashanah is Aleph and Beis Tishrei. But in a Rosh Chodesh, when you're Ma'aber the Chodesh al Pi Re'iyah, then it's the 30th of the month and Aleph. So the concern here is Rashi highlights in Dibur HaMaschil, the first Rashi and the Mishnah, a little bit more than halfway down, Dibur HaMaschil, Shemati Saber, Bigola Kamairi. Obviously, we're dealing with outside of Eretz Yisrael. Shemayasu Bezdin Agadol Elul Me'ubar. Maybe Elul will be Me'ubar, meaning the last day of Elul will be part of Rosh Hashanah. You have a logistical issue. We're concerned that they're going to be ma'aber, and if they do that 30th day of Elul, you needed to go to the east, which had it been a weekday, no problem. And on Rosh Hashanah Mamish, Rosh Hashanah Doraisa, the next day, which would be Aleph Tishrei, so then that day you needed to go to the west. So that was our concern here in this case. And let's go back to the Mishnah. What do we do in such a case? So Rabbi Yehuda's lenient. You're allowed to do 2 Eruvin. V'omer Eruvi b'rishon l'mizrach u'v'sheni l'ma'av. Now, as mentioned a couple of nights ago, this is not an issue of breira because there's nothing unknown. You're just saying Monday's going to be here and Tuesday's going to be there. That's not a problem. B'rishon l'ma'ara u'v'sheni l'mizrach, or the reverse. You can say as well, Eruvi b'rishon u'v'sheni kivnei iri, or vice versa. So I'm going to just explain it. You can say that I'm going to use my Eruv for day 1, but on day 2 I'm like everybody else. Or Eruvi b'sheni, on day 2 I'll be using my Eruv b'rishon kivnei iri. And this shita was the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. However, the Chachamim would not agree to his shita. That was case number 1. We're going to refer to case number 1 as Rosh Chodesh be'ibur. Case number 2, the Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Masna Adam ala kalkala b'yom tov rishon ve'ochle b'sheni. You are allowed to take a kalkala, a basket of tevel, and you're allowed to say a conditional meiser. You're allowed to say, if day 1 is chol, then Hareni, I'm going to make my truma separate, and then I'm going to make my meiser separate. And if day 2, we'll see in the Gemara how this details out. But we're allowed to do this ha'arama, this conditional thing with the kalkala, with the basket, to make sure we can eat that food on a 2-day yontif. That's case 2. Case 3. And as well, Rabbi Yehuda clearly being of the opinion that there's shtei kedushos, because if there was chad kedusha, then of course you could not eat a beitza shenolda b'yom tov rishon on yom tov sheni. So here, Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion that you can eat a beitza shenolda b'yom tov. You can eat it on day 2, because again, it's beis kedushos. There too, in case 3, it was rejected as well. Case 1 is Rosh Hashanah. Case 2 is kalkala of meiser, of tevel, and case 3 was beitza shenolda. We'll come back to these references later. The 4th case of the Mishnah is Reb Dosa ben Harkinas Omer ha'over lifnei ha'teva b'yom tov shel Rosh Hashanah. You were to have like emotionally been thinking about the concept. If you were to have someone who is going to stand in front of the teva, who's going to stand in front of the Aron Kodesh to be a shliach tzibur on Rosh Hashanah, Omer, what should he say? This is again in a frame where we're not exactly sure what day Rosh Hashanah is. We're relying on Ibur Chodesh. So then, Hachlitzenu Hashem Elokeinu as Yom Rosh HaChodesh Hazeh, listen to the language, Im Hayomim Lamachar, if it's today or if it's tomorrow. Ulamachar, and on the next day, who Omer, what would you say the next day? Im Hayomim Emesh, if it's today or if it's yesterday. And we don't know which day is Del so we're being the Karesh al Piyariyah, so we don't exactly know when things are. Fine. And there too, below, Hodu lo Chachamim. So the Gemara out of the gates is going to ask us exactly who are we talking about when we say that there's lo Hodu Chachamim. Who were the Chachamim, or in this case I should say, who is the Chacham, who this Mishnah is blindly referring to as Chachamim. So says the Gemara, Man lo Hodu lo. Who's the one, who is the Tana who disagrees with all of the Shitas of Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah, as well as the Shita of Rav Dosa ben Hurkenes? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav, Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says as follows: the Tanya, the Brisa writes, Modim Chachamim the Rabbi Eliezer b'Rosh Hashanah shehaya yarei shematis aber. We have a Brisa that is almost word for word the same as our Mishnah with a different man d'amar. Our Mishnah was Rabbi Yehuda. This Brisa is Rabbi Eliezer. And take a look at the language and how similar it is. I'll move rapidly through the language because we translated all of these already. Me'arev Adam, Shnei Eruvin, V'omer Eruvin Rishon L'Mizrach, V'Sheni L'Marav. You're allowed to put two Eruvin, one east, one west. V'Rishon L'Marav, V'Sheni L'Mizrach. No problem at all. You can put one in the west, one in the east. Eruvin V'Rishon V'Sheni Kivnei Iri. Day one, I'll use the Eruv. Day two, I'll be like everyone else. Eruvin V'Rishon V'Nei Uvesheni kivnei iri, that case as well. Uvesheni uverishon kivnei iri, excuse me, and all of those cases. And then what do we see? The dissenting opinion. In our Mishnah, it said chachamim lahodu, right? Here, what do we see? Rabbi Yossi oser. So that's why the Gemara makes a hashva. We have our Mishnah, which is almost an identical case here, and then we have this brisa, and the dissenting opinion in our Mishnah is referred to as the chachamim. The dissenting opinion here is referred to as Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara does a math equation. If A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. So therefore, our Chachamim and our Mishnah must be of the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. The Brisa concludes with a strong question of Rabbi Yossi against the Chachamim. Rabbi Yossi says, Amar lehen Rabbi Yossi. Remember, Rabbi Yossi was the one who was Machmir. Iatem modim, don't you agree with me? She'im bo edim min hamincha l'mala shenoagin oso hayom kodesh u'lemachar kodesh. You want to say there's shtei kedushos, but tachlis, if it comes to Mina Mencha Lamal and they're Mekadesh Tari at that time, then the rest of that day is Kodesh, and the next day is Kodesh also. And that's one Kedusha. So turning to the top of Daf, Lamed Testament Beis, says the Gemara, how would the Rabbanan have answered? Just to be clear from a layout standpoint, this is not part of the Tosefta. The Brisa ends at the last word of the bottom of the page. Now, again, structurally, we had our Mishnah, and then we had this Brisa for strong comparison, but the Gemara kind of ended. It's not quite rhetorical, but it did end with a question against the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer / Rabbi Yehuda. And as the top of the Gemara explains, the Rabbanan and Rashi adds in the words Amrei Lach. They would have argued. Of course, their answer is not really listed in the Tosefta. What would they have said? No, you're right that we treat both days with Kedusha, but that's not because there's Kedusha Achas. That's because Kiheche Delol Zulebe. That's to make sure that we don't desecrate whichever of the days is not actually Kodesh. So we're going to be Machmir, but really we still hold of Shtei Kedushos. So says the Gemara, Ve'od Amar Rabbi Yehuda, says the Gemara on Lamed Testament Beis, second line, V'tzricha, we need, what do we need? What cases are you referring to when we need? So I broke down the Mishnah as it's codified there into 4 different cases. Take a look at Rashi immediately to our left, V'tzricha. What does Rashi say that we're talking about in our Gemara? V'tzricha the Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah, Le'oruye, Le'oruye means to teach, Oraisa, the teachings. We needed to teach the Beis Kedushos Hein, the Hanach Tzalas Mile, in regards to 3 different cases. We needed to say it by Eruv, we needed to say it by Kalkala, and we needed to say it by Beitza. And just to reflect back on our Mishnah, in all 3 of these cases, we were showing Beis Kedushos. By Eruv, we showed Beis Kedushos by saying that I can put an Eruv in 2 places, day 1 over here, day 2 over there. That's Beis Kedushos. By the case of the Kalkala, the only way the condition of the Kalkala works to say, if in fact there's Meiser, that it's Tevala on day 1, I'm going to remove it if it's Chol. If today's Kodesh, then tomorrow's Chol, then I'll remove it tomorrow. That also requires Beis Kedushos. And the 3rd case of the egg, where Rabbi Yehuda says that a Beis Shenolda b'Yom Tov Rishon is mutter and Yom Tov Sheni, there too, the only way you can create a heter to eat that egg on Yom Tov Sheni is if it's Beis Kedushos. So what the Gemara is bothered by is, why do I need 3 examples of that which is Beis Kedushos? Just give me 1 example and Shalom al Yisrael. So answers the Gemara as follows, V'tzricha, we need all 3 cases. Why do we need all three cases? Says the Gemara as follows. Rosh Hashanah, if I only had the case about Eruv, the Haka Amar Rav Yehuda, maybe Rav Yehuda only said that case because Mishum Delo Ka'avid Midi, because on the holiday itself you did nothing. All the Eruvin were set before Yontif. On Yontif himself, you didn't do a single Maisa because it was all established in place before then. So therefore, maybe aval kalkala de mechse kimesakin tivla emamodeluhu l'rabbanan. But as it relates to the kalkala, to the basket where I'm going to do something conditional, tachlis, at the end of the day, I'm going to start eating that food, which means that between the time Yontif started and the time I ate that food, well, then tevel was taken off and I was misaking the food. Maybe there, Rabbi Yehuda would have agreed to the Rabbanan that it's not allowed. Kamash Malan, we needed the case of Masakin Tevel, the case of Tevel, to make sure we knew of the Kalkala, to make sure we knew that it was included in Rabbi Yehuda's Shita Beis Kedushos. Fifth line, V'yashmin and Hani Tarte, and if we had two of these cases, if we had the case of Rosh Hashanah, of the Eruvin putting east and west, and we had the case of the Kalkala, maybe in those two cases, Mishum Deleka Lemigzar Alayu, because there's no formal Gzeira D'Rabbanan on those cases. We'll see what that means momentarily. Aval Beitza, however, when it comes to Beitza Shenol B'Yom Tov, there, the Gemara in Maseches Beitza spends many dapim speaking about the Gzeiros that are attached to Beitza Shenol B'Yom Tov. The Ika Lemigzar Mishum Peiros, the Ika Lemigzar Ba, Mishum Peiros HaNoshrin, Mishum Mashkin Shazavu. There, by the Beitza Shenol B'Yom Tov, we have a number of Gzeiros that is the root for the Isser. Peiros HaNoshrin, maybe the egg that it's extracted from the animal will be possibly out of concern that we could pluck a fruit on Shabbos, make gzeira, and maybe mashkin shezavu is that you have grapes or olives that are oozing oil, maybe you'll squeeze them a little bit more, that's the egg coming out of the chicken. So we have a deeper rooted issue, a deeper rooted gzeira by the Beitza, so havamina that maybe the case of Beitza should not have been included, and really only the cases of the Rosh Hashanah Eruvin and the case of the Kalkala should be included. Kamash Malon, no, that's incorrect. Sricha. Therefore, our Mishnah delineated three cases, all of whom which do indicate Beis Kedushos, but each brought for their own reason to ensure we don't exclude a case that we might have otherwise erroneously excluded. 10 lines down at the 2 dots. Now we're going to bring in yet another source in the Tanai. This is a great theme that we're seeing Mishnah after Mishnah. Very often when Mishnayos have other Tanaic sources, they're brought very early on, right after a Mishnah, so that we can do the comparative analysis between our Mishnah and any lingering Tanaic sources. Here is yet another one that speaks about a Kalkala. Tanya, the Brisa writes, Ketzad, how do we execute this whole thing with the Kalkala as referenced in our Mishnah by Rabbi Yehuda? This Brisa is also Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Masna Adam al Kalkala b'Yom Tov Rishon v'Ochel b'Sheni. You can make a condition on Yom Tov Rishon and then it's finally edible by the second day. What is the condition? Here's how it works. You have 2 baskets of tevel in front of you. Omer, he says as follows, Im hayom chol ulamachar kodesh, if today is really a weekday, midoraisa, and tomorrow is really yontif midoraisa, tehezu trumasi alzu, then today I'm telling you that basket number 1 is meiser and basket number 2 is now chulin. I can now finally eat that food. But the reverse, v'im hayom kodesh ulamachar chol, if today is kodesh and tomorrow is chol, ein bidvari klum, then today is a nothing. Then we can consider as if this condition is in place, and then by the second day I can eat it. Ulamachar, the second day, what am I going to say? The second day I'm going to say, Uomer im hayom chol tehezo truma alzo im hayom kodesh ein bidvari klum l'kor le'Hashem ve'ochla. So Rabbi Yehuda basically explains in detail how we would say the conditions with 2 baskets of tevel. And it works perfectly such that by the second day, you're actually allowed to eat the tevel, in line with the shita in our Mishnah, that the case of the Kalkala is representative of his shita of Beis Kedushos. Perfect. Rav Yossi Oser, no surprise. This is another brisa where Rav Yossi is l'shitaso. And as Rav opened our Gemara, that Rav Yossi is the one who in our Mishnah is the Chachamim lo hodulo. So this again works out perfectly. However, at the end of this brisa is a line that we will soon see is quite complicated, and that line is like this. We're almost halfway down Lamed Testament Beis, and that is V'chein haya Rav Yossi Omer, still Oser, still part of the same brisa. He was Oser b'shnei yamim tovim shel galios. He was Oser, or what was he Oser? What was he Oser? Was he Oser the case of the tevel? Wasn't that what we were just talking about? So a little difficult to understand what he's talking about here. The Gemara is going to discuss this. We're about halfway down. Just as a little bit of a background to what we're about to read, the Amoraim used to write their Torah in two forms. The first form is what's referred to as a memra. A memra is a statement, for example, Amar Rav halacha ke'ex. That would be like a memra. Or Amar Rav lo shanu ella ke'ex, but if Y, then no. Right? That's a memra, a halachic statement. But there was another format in which the Amoraim wrote, and that is story form. And this was, it's hard to know exactly which words they wrote. Very difficult to know that. Very hard to know exactly which words. But the story itself, be'etzem, was a statement that was made by Amoraim. So let's see. We're going to see a few of these stories today. Let's get started halfway down, and of course connected to what we're learning to. Hahu bar Tavia, there was a deer to asa lebei reish galusa, and it was brought into the home of the reish galusa. The itzid biyom tov rishon shel galios. It was trapped on the first day of Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz. The ishtachit, and it was shechted biyom tov sheni. So what's the din? It was trapped on day 1, and it was shechted on day 2. So we have a machlokas amoraim about this case. Rav Nachman v'Rav Chizda achlu. The two of them said no problem. What do they seemingly hold? Beis kedushos, because they were willing to let the trapping happen on day 1, and on day 2, when the shechita was done, they were able to bifurcate and say day 1 was day 1, day 2 is day 2. So I'm going to enjoy this deer, and I'm going to eat it with you. If some salting issues, how are you allowed to salt on Shabbos? We don't allow for salting on Shabbos because we say that maliach kimavusham. We have a principle like that in halacha that, let's say, for example, you were to take cucumber and you were to stick it in brine on Shabbos. That's bishul derabanan. We don't allow for that. It's considered bishul derabanan, that maliach kimavusham. So here, obviously, you can't salt on Yontif, but you can roast, and roasting is a replacement, an appropriate replacement for salting. So I'm just adding a sidebar that they could not have salted this in a regular way. What?
Why can you not salt on Yom
Oh, you're correct. You're absolutely correct. You can salt on Yom Tov. Although I wonder.
Unless it's maybe Ma'abed.
Is it part of the shechita process?
You're right. I was just thinking in terms of Shabbos, but
Right.
it's not part of the shechita process in a halachic way. Shechita is very narrow. Kana veshed, and you're done. Then the shechita is done. But you have another block, which is that you can't eat it until the blood's removed. So then we salt. But normally
Can
the
you remove the
salting.
blood on Yom Tov?
That's what we're saying, is that
Right.
on Shabbos you can't, not because you can't remove the blood. On Shabbos you can't because you can't salt.
Right.
But you're right. I'll remove my caveat. I mean, it's still true, but it's only applicable to Shabbos. I presume you're allowed to do it on Yom Tov. Your question sounds correct.
It really is open, huh?
What are you doing Sunday? Let's give it a try.
I'd rather barbecue if we're discussing it. Forget the salt. I'd much rather stick it over a spit and get it done the right way.
Right.
So Rav Nachman v'Rav Chizda achlu, they said no problem, we can eat. Rav Sheshes la'achal. However, Rav Sheshes was not willing to, implying, of course, that Rav Sheshes holds it's kedusha achas, right? So you have to see how all of there's like a whole subtext to everything we're reading here. So let's see. Amar Rav Nachman, what am I going to do? I've got someone to feed. My abid le Rav Sheshes to la'achil bisra detavia. He's not eating the deer. Nebuch, what should I do? It says the Gemara, Amar le Rav Sheshes v'hechi echol. How am I possibly allowed to eat? What Mari Makom was he pointing to? The end of the brisa that we just saw about the kalkala. That line that was very confusing that Rav Yossi said. Ditani Isi, he actually quotes it from a different brisa. So apparently this line of Rav Yossi, it made the rounds. So Isi quoted this, V'amri la Isi Tani. It's either Ditani Isi or Isi Tani. V'chein, what did it say? Quote, V'chein haya Rav Yossi oser b'shnei yamim tovim shel galios. You're not allowed to do that on the 2 days of Yantiv, seemingly implying our case, says Rav Sheshes, that what? That you're not allowed to allow for the trapping to happen on day 1, and then the shechita on day 2 and eat it. And he says it must be that Rav Yossi did not allow for such a thing. Omar Rava says, I don't understand. We're 2/3 of the way down Lamed Testament Beis. I don't understand. Umay Kushya, why is that? Sorry. Yeah. Yep, correct. Umay Kushya, what's the problem? Dil Mahachi Kamar. Maybe this is what Rav Yossi meant. V'chein haya Rav Yossi oser b'shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah b'gola. That's not the words that he used, but maybe that's what he meant, that we were not talking about regular double days of Yantif, but he was talking about Rosh Hashanah Begola, and therefore, because we treat Rosh Hashanah as a Yom Ha'arichta, we treat it as 1 day of Kedusha Achas, not Midoraisa granted, because Midoraisa we paskin shtei Kedushos across the board. But we do have concerns, even nowadays, we do treat Rosh Hashanah as a Yom Ha'arichta. So says the Gemara, I don't understand, just say that Rav Yossi was referencing a case of Rosh Hashanah. So says the Gemara, well, Ihachi, if that's true, Shel Galios, But the language that he should have used was the language that he did use was shel galios, but begola mebaile. It should have been begola, just in one location, right? You're in gola, you're in one place. Says the Gemara, Amar Avasi, my kusha, that's not a problem either. Even saying galios is not a problem. Why? Because dilma hachi kamar. This might be pshat in Rabbi Yossi. V'chein haya Rabbi Yossi ose iser shnei yamim tovim shel galios kishnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah l'Rabbanan d'sharu. Maybe the way that Rav Yossi viewed the 2 days, a regular 2 days of Yontif in Chutz La'aretz, is the same way that the Rabbanan leniently looked at Rosh Hashanah by saying that you're allowed to eat the meat. And then the story continues with the following, because everything hit the pavement in the next part of the story. Ashkachte Rav Sheshes, the Rabbi Bar Shmuel. Rav Sheshes was already in the midst of this sugya, and then he bumped into Rabbi Bar Shmuel. Amar le Tani Mar Midi Biktushos. Did Rebbe teach anything about the Kedushos? Namely, is it 1 day or is it 2 day of Kedushos? How is it Beis Kedushos for Yantif, or is it Kedusha Achas? So Amar Le, so Rabbi Bar Shmuel answers Rav Sheshes and says, Tanina, we already learned this. Mode Reb Yossi b'shnei yamim tovim shel galios. He's moded that it's Beis Kedushos, on each day is its own day. And then all of a sudden, Rav Sheshes was so embarrassed. He said he wasn't allowed to eat it. Why weren't you allowed to eat it if it's Beis Kedushos? Amar le imishkachas lehu. If you find the other rabbis, who are the other rabbis? It's the 2 rabbis who were willing to eat the deer. It was Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda. Lo tema lehu. Don't tell them. Don't tell them that you just told this to me. Rashi, what's Rav Sheshes all concerned about? So Rashi says, Lo tema lahu. It's in the about 15 lines from the bottom, in the middle width section of the Rashis, a few lines before it gets wide. Dibra mascha lo tema lahu. Lo tema lahu lai milsa. Don't tell them that we just discussed this. The michzafili, it's embarrassing for me. Al delo achlis minei. I'm embarrassed that I didn't partake from their food simply because I misunderstood Rav Yossi. I didn't realize that Rav Yossi held that it was taka beis kedushos. I didn't realize that. Otherwise, I would have eaten it. So you would have had the tzad on day 1. You would have had the shchita on day 2. Everyone should have partaken from the food. Okay, that should have been. So he was a little embarrassed. What does that mean? He's embarrassed. Okay. Amar Rav Ashi says, wait a minute. This whole story about trapping on day 1 and shchita on day 2 is all wrong. Amar Rav Ashi, l'didi amar li ameimar. Ameimar told me the story a little bit differently. Hahu bar tavya, lav itzu de itzid. There was a deer, but it wasn't trapped. Rashi, all the way at the bottom of the page, last line. Lo itzude itzid devadai pshita leila Rav Sheshes to shari b'sheni. That's for sure. If the animal wasn't trapped and all you had to do was shchita, I mean, what's the problem? Says Gemara, no. What was the case? There had to be some complexity. So the complexity was top of Mem Amid Aleph. Ella michutz latchum asa. The problem is that the animal came in michutz latchum. There was no tzad. You didn't trap him in an enclosed space. You didn't shut a gate behind him. He wasn't corralled, nothing. And it's not considered tzad if you can grab an animal b'chad shichya. If you can just grab his collar and it's easy, that's not called tzad. Picking up a dog is not called tzad. Just pick up the dog, pick up a cat. Now, if they slither, if they run, and you're outside, if you're inside, they're already trapped. They already need some mibod yom. But if they're outdoors, can you pick up an animal because of tzad? If it's easy to pick up the animal, then it's not called tzad. If you have a fish that's sitting there, it's mamish not moving, and you pick it up with a basket, that's not tzad. It's b'chad shichya. It's easy to pick up the animal. So that's not what. So here we're not talking about an isser of tzad. The problem is that the animal wasn't shaykh to me because it was outside the tchum, and then it became shaykh to me. So that's our question. And this was our machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Yitzchak on the one side, not Rav Yitzchak, Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda on the one side, who were willing to eat the deer, and Rav Sheshes on the other. Here's the machlokes. Man de ochal, the one who was willing to eat it, he said, Savar, it's really Savru, it should be Savru, did they change the gears? No. Savar, they must hold, Hababishvil Yisrael Zem, Mutter Yisrael Acher, that let's say the case was that a goy, the Mefor should point this out, that a goy brought in the animal from Mechutz L'Tchum. So you have a little shtikal amir la'akum type of issue going on. If you brought it in for one person, so then it's mutter for another Jew to eat. So then everyone's allowed to eat the meat, say Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda, no problem. Uman de lo achal Rav Sheshes, Savar called the asi lebei reish galusa daita dekulu rabbanon asi. Anything, if the guy is going to bring in this animal Mechutz L'Tchum, it's for everyone who's at the home of the Reish Galusa. It's everyone. It's a daita de Rabbanan. It's for all the rabbis, and therefore Rav Sheshes was not willing to eat. Hold on 1 second. Something in the story doesn't make sense. Remember what we said that Rav Sheshes did in the midst of this story? He asked a shaila about Beis Kedushos. Why would he ask? Why would he do that? We're not even discussing Beis Kedushos. The top Rashi points out Uvo Bayom. Everything was in the same day. So what? So says the Gemara. I don't understand. You told me as part of the story that Rav Sheshes went over to Rabbi Bar Shmuel and said, hey, I'm stuck in this shiloh with the deer. Does Rebbe hold Beis Kedushos? Why would he do that if it's all in one day? In a Meimar's version of the story, there's no need for him to even ask the question about Beis Kedushos. So says the Gemara, Lo hayu dvar me'olam. That conversation never happened. You guys got it wrong. So the conversation never happened, and therefore now we have version 2 of the story, one that seems to be a little bit cleaner. And again, both versions have to be analyzed to see which ones are halacha l'maisa. But nevertheless, that brings us to our next story, a next Amoraic story. Here we are. We're about 6 lines down on the top of Mem Amud Al. Hahu lifta. There was a turnip to Asi Mechoza, and it was brought into Mechoza, seemingly on Yantiv. Nafak Rava went outside. Chazir de Kmisha, and he saw that the food didn't look fresh. It was wrinkled. It was a little scrunchy, and he was able to tell Shara Rava lemizben mineh. You were allowed to buy it, quote unquote. You can't buy things on Yantiv, but you were able to. Ha'arama, you could take it, collateral, however they would do it on Shabbos. They were able to take it from the person and eat it on Shabbos. Amar, Havada, me ismol nekra. This was for sure plucked yesterday. It doesn't look fresh. You can tell after a day. After we had all of our trees break down in our neighborhood, after a couple days, the leaves began to wither. It doesn't take long. So he was able to look at this fruit or vegetable. He was a bucky. He was able to say this vegetable was plucked before Shabbos. So says the Gemara, my Amris, what might you say? Mechutz l'tchum asya. Oh, maybe the guy brought it from somewhere else. So says the Gemara, Haba b'shvil Yisrael zeh motor le'echol Yisrael acher. He agreed with the shita above of Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda from the second line. He agreed with that if something comes from outside the tchum, that you're still allowed to eat it. Says the Gemara, "B'kol shekein hai da'adai to the nachar masa." This is especially true in this case when the people doing the work were not doing it for Jews in particular. They were buying fruits. They just happened to be coming to town on a Tuesday. Happens to be Yontif. The Goyim didn't know it was Yontif. The Yid sees it and he wants to bring some home. No problem. So the Gemara says because it was specifically done for a Goy, for Goyim in general, so we can be the beneficiary. However, Rava took notice that Kevan de Chazad the Kamafshe Umaisi Lahu. Rava was watching the supply. And he saw that the Goyim figured out when Yantif was, and they were increasing their supply. So once he saw that the Goyim were doing that with these vegetables, then he no longer allowed people to partake from it because the Goyim were bringing in michutz l'tchum. They were bringing it in, but really it was no longer only for the sake of a nachri. It was also for the sake of the Jews, and then he did not allow it. This leads to a discussion of Isser Shabbos, which we're going to get to, which is, are you allowed to be the beneficiary of the malacha of a goy on Shabbos? Let's see the next story. We're at the 2 dots, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines down on Mem Amud Aleph, 1/3 of the way down. Let us continue doing good on time. Here we go. Hanhu b'nei Genana. There were these people who were b'nei Genana. They used to decorate these little pergolas or these little houses or kind of let's look at Rashi. He does a better job than everyone. B'nei Genana, 4th line. Koshrei kilos lechasanim v'nosin sham hadas. I guess they were kind of like chuppahs of some kind, and they would put hadassim, they put myrtle there. So it says the Gemara, Hu Genana the gazu lahu, they were goyim. That's what Rashi, the Meforshim would point out, the gazu lahu and nachri, that they were cutting this bi Yom Tov Sheni. They were cutting it on Yom Tov Sheni. That's an Isser D'Rabbanan, and a guy doing an Isser D'Rabbanan. Can I benefit from that? So let's see, L'urta, at night, Shar lahu Ravina la'aruche be'la altar. Ravina was of the opinion that they were allowed to smell them instantly. Omar le Rava bar Tachlifa la Ravina. Rava bar Tachlifa asks her, this is not the Rava that we know from the 4th century. This Rava is older, probably multiple generations older, because Ravina was one of the last generations of the Amoraim, one of the editors of the Gemara in one of its earliest forms. So says the Gemara, he asks the following question to Ravina. We should be concerned that people are going to think if you're allowed to smell it on Shabbos, that you're allowed to cut it b'chatchila on Shabbos. If you're not a Ben Torah, if you don't really know what you're talking about, you watch one person do a heter, and you inappropriately apply it to your life. People do that all the time. Oh, the Rav paskined for you, that means you're not a Ben Torah. You don't get to apply your own shilas and shuvas to yourself. You have to ask a shilah. So the Gemara says, asking against Ravina, why are you saying that this is mutter for the average Jew? It should only be mutter for bnei. It should not be mutter for bnei Torah. So maski floor of shame taima dein and bnei Torah have bnei Torah shari. It shouldn't be allowed for anyone. Why not? The principle of bichdei sheyasu is that when an isra malacha is done, when a guy does a malacha on Shabbos, you cannot benefit from it. How long do you have to wait after Shabbos? As long as it would have taken to make that food. L'dugma. Let's say that you wanted to go to Dunkin' Donuts immediately after Shabbos. So coffee is easy. Coffee takes a minute to make. No problem. You can get coffee. Now, let's say you wanted a donut. So you have to wait to buy a donut, bichdei sheyasu, they're goyim. They were making it for Jews and non-Jews alike. They're making it for the tzibur. If you want to eat that donut after Shabbos, you have to find out how long does it take to take the dough, or however they make it, all the ingredients, roll it up, put it in a circle, boil it or bake it. I don't know what they do. It tastes very good. I don't know how they make them. So that's bichdei sheyasu. Let's call it 15 minutes. So you have to wait that long to buy it. Otherwise, you're not allowed. That's what's going on right here. This says Ladina. We paskin this way in regards to going to do malacha for Jews on Shabbos all the time. If you're going to benefit from someone's malacha, you have to wait. Bichdei sheyasu. The words translate as follows: with enough time to do what was done. So the donuts, you got to wait X amount of 15 minutes. Again, there's a lot of parts of making a donut that's a malacha. There's lush, there's afiyah, there's a lot of steps there. It's the whole sidur the pas. So you have to see how long it actually is. Halacha l'maaseh. So they didn't know what to do. So then Azlu shailuha l'Rabbi. They went to go ask a shaila. Amar lahu ba'inan bichdei sheyasu. So then they went to ask a shaila, and the psak was, you're right. You have to wait bichdei sheyasu. You're not allowed to smell it. You have to wait as long as it takes to actually cut the myrtle from the branch, which doesn't take that long. Next case, Rav Dosa Omer. We learned in our Mishnah, ha'over lifnei hateva, that when there is someone davening on Rosh Hashanah, that they should use this language. If you look back in the Mishnah, it says, I'll just read it here. It says, Hachlitzenu Hashem Elokeinu as Yom Rosh HaChodesh Hazeh. So there's two features of this that Rav Dosa adds. Number one is that we mention Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. We don't do this, but there is a shita here in the Mishnah that says that you're supposed to. And not only do we mention Rosh Chodesh, but it also adds in the conditional aspect that if today is the holy day, then great. And if tomorrow is the holy day, then great. All right, the conditions. So two features that Rav Dosa adds. Number one is that we double Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah. And number two is we add the conditions. At the two dots, a little bit more than halfway down, Mem Amud Aleph. Almost there, we're going to get to the top of Mem Amud Beis, and then we're going to stop. So says the Gemara, do we have time for Marv? Yes, we do. Says the Gemara as follows. Amar Rabba ki havinon be'rav huna. When they were analyzing this in Shir, Ibayalan. This was the question that came up. Mahu lahazkir shel Rosh Chodesh b'Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, we say, Yom HaZikaron Hazeh. Do we also say Yom HaZikaron Yom Rosh HaChodesh Hazeh? Are we duplicating things? Is that how we would treat the? Do we do that? So it says the Gemara. Well, let's see. Kevan dechalukin b'musaf and amrinan, because they have different korbanos. Right? Rosh Chodesh korbanos are one, and the specific korbanos for Rosh Hashanah are different. They're listed differently in the Torah. So maybe we should argue that because, typically speaking, Musaf is predicated on korbanos, so I should have separate references, one for Rosh Hashanah and one for Rosh Chodesh. So that's one possibility. O Dilma, or perhaps Zicharon Echad Ola Lekanu Lekan. Because they're really be'etzem talking about the same thing, even though they have distinct and different korbanos, but maybe they can still be included in one fell swoop. Amarlan, so in Shir, they were discussing this, and they said, Tani Tua, we learned this already. Where did we learn it? In our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? Rabbi Dosi Omer, however, Lifnei Ateva V'chuli, my lav lahazkir. Wasn't he talking about to mention Rosh Chodesh as well as Rosh Hashanah? In which case, you'd say both. In which case, we're saying separate korbanos overrides. So says the Gemara, lo lahasnos. That's not the case. What that Mishnah was referring to was not the fact that it said Rosh Chodesh, but the conditions. It says the Gemara, hachanami mistabra. This makes sense that the focus of our Mishnah is the conditions. Because we have a separate brisa that quotes Rabbi Dosa as well. On Rosh Chodesh in general, shall kol hashana kula v'lo hodulo. And they did not agree with him. Now, what did they not agree with him on? I amris, first of the longest lines, Mem Amud Aleph. I amris bishlam alahasnos. If what you're saying is that what they didn't agree with him on was lahasnos mishum hachi lo hodulo. That's why they wouldn't have agreed with him. Ela I amris lahazkir. But if what he was saying is to not mention it, why wouldn't they agree? It's Rosh Chodesh. It's a regular Rosh Chodesh. We say this all the time. Mikadesh, what is the language? Mechadesh chodashim. Is that the bracha we make by Musaf? Bracha Hashem, Mechadesh chodashim. I think so. Right. What's the bracha? Chata Hashem, Mechadesh chodashim. I think it is Mechadesh chodashim. Yeah. Either way, whatever the closing is, it can't be that that's what they're arguing about, because that's every Rosh Chodesh. That's not in conflict with Rosh Hashanah. So therefore, says the Gemara, it must be that the machlokes is about lehasnos, a perfect argument. Says the Gemara, that can't be. Ve'elamai, what's the other option? Lehasnos. Is it? What, where are you? That's Musaf Rosh Chodesh? Kadesh Yisrael Rosh Chodashim. Yeah. Where do we say Mechadesh Chodesh? What's the bracha by Kiddush Levana? That's where you say Mechadesh Chodashim. Yeah, I just got mixed up. So it says the Gemara 5-6 lines from that. Ve'elamai, you're saying that the argument is that the way we understand Rabbi Dosa is that he's talking about the hasnos. But if that's the case, then we have a double machlokas. We have a machlokas in our Mishnah about Rosh Hashanah and Lahasnos and the conditions therein. And we also, in the Brisa, have a machlokas between Rosh Chodesh and the conditions. Lama le'li ifluge b'tarte. Why would the Chachamim pitch Reb Dosi as having this strange, very, very similar double machlokas? One about Rosh Hashanah and one about Rosh Chodesh. Says the Gemara, tzricha, our second tzricha of the day. We need both. D'yashmin and Rosh Hashanah, if we only had our Mishnah, habamina behaka amri rabbanon, Delo, in our Mishnah, that's where the Chachamim would push back against Rabbi Dosa about the conditions, about saying if today, then no, if tomorrow, then no. Delo, Mishum de'asi lezilzulebe, we're afraid on Rosh Hashanah that it would be a zilzul. Masha'in ken about Baroshei Chodashim shel kol hashana kula. It's not such a zilzul. It's a zilzul to Rosh Hashanah. It's not a zilzul to Stam Rosh Chodesh. So ima modu le Reb Dosi. Maybe they would have agreed with Reb Dosi. But if you would have said the machlokas was here with this new brisa, the brisa that speaks about Rosh Chodesh instead of Rosh Hashanah, so it'd be Idmar B'ha, then maybe B'ha Kamar Rav Dosa, maybe only there would he allow it. Aval B'hach Ema Modu L'Hu L'Rabbanon, but maybe then he would have then agreed, with the Rabbanon. It says Gemara Tzricha, we therefore need it to be the case that we had both machlokos, one, our Mishnah about the world of Rosh Hashanah, and two, the brisa that we just learned here at, where was it? Right here, a few lines before the lines get narrow, about Rosh Chodesh. Says the Gemara, quickly, Meisive, we have a question. Hold on one second. If what you're saying is that we're supposed to, in fact, mention Rosh Chodesh in Rosh Hashanah, then we have a problem. We have a problem with Beis Shammai. What's the problem? The problem is that in general, Beis Shammai had a rule that every bracha had to have a distinct nature. And here they were given their own brachos. For example, Atachon Antanu would have been given its own bracha, right? We've seen that before in Maseches bracha. So let's see. Rosh Hashanah Shechalios B'Shabbos. Amazing how this works out, that we're discussing this Gemara less than 24 hours before Rosh Hashanah Shechalios B'Shabbos. Rosh Hashanah Shechalios B'Shabbos, Beis Shammai Amrim Mispalo Eser. Shmona Esrei has 10 brachos. It's the first 3, the last 3, Kedushas Hayom, and it is Shofros, Malchios, Shofros, and Zichronos. Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros. So that's the 10. We can blend one of them together. However, V'im Isa, and then look at the last Rashi on the page, V'im Isa demazker shel Rosh Chodesh, if in fact what you're going to say is that we have to add a distinct bracha for Rosh Chodesh, then because Beis Shammai has a rule that everything that needs to be said as a bracha gets its own bracha, it should no longer be 10. The Beis Shammai achas esrei boile should have been 11. Turning to the top of Mem Amud Beis, a few lines before the end, Amar Reb Zera, shiny Rosh Chodesh, mitoch shekolel l'shachris v'arbis kol nami musafin. Rosh Chodesh is different, that because by shachris and arbis we wove in the Rosh Chodesh reference into a particular bracha of Ritzei. It didn't get his own bracha. Even Beis Shammai would agree to that. Then by Musaf too, we would not distinguish between Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah. Now, Ladina, we don't even do this. We don't speak about Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah. We just speak about Yom HaZikaron. Umi islahu leBeis Shammai kolel. Does Beis Shammai actually agree that by Shachris and Arbis that we would include the Mein HaMeorah, the Rosh Chodesh reference by Shachris and Arbis into one bracha? Ve'atanya Rosh Chodesh Shechalios b'Shabbos Beis Shammai Omer Mispalel Shmone uBeis Hillel Omer Mispalel Sheva. We normally say 7 brachos on Shabbos, 3 beginning, 3 end, and 1 in the middle. But we see a brisa that indicates we see a brisa that indicates that that Beis Shammai would hold that you need to say 8. What's the 8? 3 in the beginning, 3 at the end, Shabbos plus seemingly Rosh Chodesh. Says the Gemara, Chaka, good question. Kasha, that's a very good question. Do we say that Beis Hillel, that the Beis Shammai would be of the opinion of Kolel, and that we do not know. So we'll stop here at the top of Memam days, 5 lines down at the 2 dots. Mirza Hashem, not tomorrow, but on Rosh Hashanah day 1. Mirza Hashem, I really hope so. We'll get to, where do we need to get to? To the bottom of Mem Aleph Amud Beis, and then the next day will just be 1 line. Mirza Hashem. Wishing you all Ksiva, Achasim Tova.